Welcome back. Today I'm reading Chapter 4 of Love and Lovecraft. Let's get at it. Okay. Chapter 4. Eons ago, long before ancient man first stepped upon this landscape and endeavored to tame it and shape it to fit his desires, a clear, cold trickle of melted glacier water dribbled from the distant molar-shaped peaks of the Barnacle Mountains. As the ice fields vanished, the trickle became a gushing stream, and with its persistent motion had carved a broad, fertile valley between a series of rolling hills, very pleasing and sensible in composition. The river, which was broad but not deep, and swift but not dangerous, was known to the cartographers of the nation as Dunham River, but for those who lived in the valley it was simply called the Waters, for no other freshet, creek, or tributary in the vicinity matched its importance. The waters traveled generally in an east-west direction, cutting the county in two equal halves, with Upper Dunham to the north and Lower Dunham to the south. Lovecraft Cottage, Northwich Hall, and a cluster of farms were located in the more fertile soils of Upper Dunham, while the Darlings, as well as the majority of the village and businesses, were situated in Lower Dunham. There were four main methods of crossing the waters. These included a wooden footbridge to the west, which was too small to warrant a name, the village bridge, a wide arched stone construction which crossed in the center of town, narrow church bridge, and the rickety East Bridge. East Bridge would have been a very long way to go, as it was on the farthest edge of Dunham County at the opposite end of the valley, almost into the neighboring county of Hornwood. The village bridge was the most centrally located, and therefore the busiest crossing, often clogged with wagons and barrows during the week, and on holidays by carriages or pedestrians. Church Bridge, however, lay more accommodatingly in the direction of the Darling home, so that was the route which Jane and I chose. We walked down Mill Road to the crossroads, then headed west as far as the Church of St. Dismas. Generations past, it had been built as a place of sanctuary and reflection, but time had worn heavily upon it, and as churches go, it was no longer a friendly building. Instead, the weathered granite edifice appeared heavily battered, as if recently in a brawl, and the arched door looked less like a welcoming entrance and more like a hungry scowl. On either side of the door were two squinting stained-glass windows. They watched people pass over the bridge and promised eternal hellfire and damnation to those they found lacking in piety. The square-sided steeple had sunk on its foundations and listed slightly to one side, tilting at just enough of a degree for one to doubt one's senses. All around the building, the churchyard was humpy and bumpy, speckled with crooked stone crosses and long tufts of lush green grass, and like a crouched gargoyle, the church perched on a rise in the land to guard the bridge. We hurried past. Father Noonan stood in the door, looking lonely and staunch in his black robes, and he waved as we scurried by. As children, we'd avoided the church, for there were too many tales of ghostly dogs haunting the grounds for us to find comfort or succor in this holy place. One particular folk tale, the Grim of St. Dismas, was enough to cause Emma to squeal in fright whenever she spotted a black mutt, even if the poor thing had a lolling tongue and a wagging tail. Of course, our family rarely attended on Sundays, for like many of the Bierce lineage, my mother was staunchly agnostic. My father had once been a religious man, but he'd claimed he'd seen too much of the world to accept the priest's stories without a generous measure of salt, and my mother approved of him spending his Sunday with his bees rather than with a congregation. However, as I had grown, I'd found Father Noonan's stories to be quite engaging. He was a mild, even-tempered man, passionate about history and full of wonder, originally hailing from Hornwood. I waved back and bid him a good day. When time allowed, I always enjoyed a good conversation with the clergyman, but today our schedule did not permit such distractions. Once across Church Bridge, the twin-rutted road led into a deep, uncultivated wood. This lush forest of yews, cedars, hemlocks, and maples was friendly and soothing to the eye. Unlike a pretty watercolor painting, the wagon track curved and meandered amongst the copses, carefree and capricious. Most of the woodland road was flat and easy, very suitable to walking, but in the south it sharply rose, climbing in steady paces towards the high, flat plateau of Dreadmore Heath. While the forest was inviting, the grim heath was not. There the soil was a noxious mix of greasy black sand and gummy peat, and a wide swath of heather and gorse covered the entire southwestern quarter of Dunham County. There were no creeks nor hills to soften the heath's appearance, nor farms to cultivate corn, nor bowers of green trees. The heath was as welcoming as the moon, and the wind whipped wickedly over it, whistling through granite boulders that stuck like rotten teeth from sockets of viscous mud. It was here, between desolate heath and comely forest in the sheltering lee side of the hill, that Mr. Reginald Darling owned a sprawling country home, surrounded by a wooden fence and set next to a bubbling spring. In summer, their house and outbuildings floated on a froth of honeysuckles, dahlias, and hellebores, but in late spring the yard was covered with a low velvet of green and a scattering of daffodils, and one had a clear view of the path, fences, and plaster walls. The house was painted a butter yellow, and so was the chicken coop and the pig shed behind, and this color matched well with the thatch of the beehives and the wicker of the fencing. If one admired the Darling property in isolation, it appeared quite lovely and civilized. However, if one stepped back to look at the wider vista of hill slope and valley, the little homestead took on a different, darker character. One noticed the nearness of the high barren heath, all covered with stunted brambles and rocky outcroppings. Such feral, unpredictable elements gave the impression of circling tigers, lurking around the house and preparing to spring, and transformed the cheerful home into a rabbit cowering in the curve of the hill. Jane and I walked arm in arm through the woods and up the road towards the Darling house. She kept her rose-pink parasol firmly closed, and I held my straw bonnet to my crown to keep the wind from whisking it away. We knocked upon the door. An elderly housemaid opened it, invited us in, and guided us into the parlor where Mrs. Darling was already waiting. "Thank you, Eunice," she said, and the old woman silently slipped away to the kitchen. "Girls, look at the two of you. How lovely to see you. Have a seat, please. The men have gone onto open land to hunt for grouse, but they'll return within the half hour, I'm sure." "Thank you, ma'am," said Jane, sitting alongside the fireplace. "It's very kind of Frederick to invite us for lunch." "Oh, my dears, I'm happy for it. The boys are eager to strengthen your acquaintance." Eunice brought a folded wooden table, and then tea and cups, and then plates of ham and leek sandwiches. Mrs. Darling poured out a cup for each of us. "Now," she said with great pomp, and I had the sudden suspicion that this luncheon had not been George or Frederick's idea, and they may not even be aware of our attendance. "Do tell me, how is your mother?" "Very well this morning," said Jane. "And your father?" "Also well," I replied, "and our other sisters too." "And the man of Northwich Hall, have you had occasion to meet him yet?" "Ah, here is the true reason for our invitation," I thought to myself, but replied, "No, he has been very reclusive. I went earlier today to greet him, but he was unavailable to come to the door." "I've heard further rumors from our precious Mrs. Runkle," she began, licking her thin lips. "He's quite repulsive, I've been told, and very persnickety." "Has she seen him again?" said Jane. "Oh, yes, early in the morning before the shops are open. Apparently Mr. Blackwood is a regular visitor to the postal counter, but he only comes in the hour before dawn to gather his parcels and mail away his packages. He is in daily correspondence with a university in California, she says, and very secretive about the nature of his work." She dropped her voice. "He does not like the heat of the sun," she claims, "and avoids all human interaction if it can be helped." "Mrs. Runkle is a busybody," I said, and Jane looked scandalized by my opinion, but Mrs. Darling giggled and clapped her hands. "Oh, she is, and we are richer for it," the woman squealed. "She is a font of information. She tells me that Mr. Blackwood is a fussy fellow of a private disposition, so reclusive that he keeps no staff to attend him. Doesn't that make him all the more interesting to the rest of us?" A thump and bump at the rear of the home caught our attention, and soon enough 3 men entered into the parlor, showing great surprise at our presence. Elder Mr. Darling, the uncle, had an athletic, spry form for his 50 years, and his chestnut-colored hair curled around the tops of his ears and the nape of his neck with only a sparse sprinkle of gray. Upon seeing visitors in his parlor, he gave us a merry, toothy smile, and removed his tweed cap to bow low in Jane's direction. "Good afternoon, Miss Lovecraft," he said. "Very pleased to see you again. And you," he said to me, doffing his hat in my direction, "Miss Lovecraft, it has been too long since we've crossed paths. The Easter egg hunt in late March, no, when you were reading fairy stories to the children at the library." "Sir," I replied, holding out my hand and shaking his palm firmly, "a pleasure to see you again." His emotions erupted through me like a jolly song in a silent room. He felt tired and elated from a pleasant morning spent in the open air of the heath, and he was famished from all his hiking. Frederick and George came in one after another, and both took seats on the sofa. Made brutish with hunger, George grabbed a sandwich and began to devour it in a series of huge bites. But Frederick kept his manners about him. He resisted the sandwich's allure and folded his hands on his lap and said, "Ladies, what a delight." "How was your hunt?" Jane asked. "A success, I hope?" "Not at all," George said around a mouthful of chewed leek and bread. "There's nothing alive on that barren plain, I swear." "It's most strange," said the elder Mr. Darling to his wife. "Not a bird nor beast upon it. I've never seen the place more quiet." Mrs. Darling cared not a whit for the animals upon the heath or their absence, but I was intrigued. "Nothing?" I said. "How curious. Thinking back now, I heard no songbirds this morning either, which struck me as odd at the time." "It is quite odd," Mr. Darling agreed. "No tracks, no scat, no hint of movement. I have never seen the place so desolate. It's almost as if every scrap of life has been removed, and all traces of them scrubbed clean." "Is that not unnatural?" said Jane. "The heath is normally such a lively place this time of year, with all the hawks and sparrows returning after winter." "I'd hoped to bag a grouse for dinner," Frederick replied. "I'm sorry, Auntie, I've brought nothing home for Eunice to prepare." He turned his attention to Jane. "I'm an accomplished hunter, you know. I took down a 12-point stag last year while traveling in the Highlands. What a magnificent creature it was. A most impressive sweeping rack of antlers. The mounted head decorates my office in town. I have a very large office, you see, with a central location, and a staff of 3, and many good clients, and they find the stag's head makes a wonderful conversation piece." "How lovely," says Jane, overwhelmed by this volley of information. "And you, George," I said, hoping to steer the conversation away from Frederick's blustering, "what do you do to amuse yourself?" He'd already finished his second sandwich and was reaching for a third. "Well, I'm not an accomplished sportsman, that's for certain," he laughed, "but I enjoy a night on the town from time to time, and a spot of gambling to make the heart flutter. Do you play cards, Miss Lovecraft?" "I do," I said. "I particularly enjoy cinch and jubilee. We should play a match." This perked him up. But instantly Mrs. Darling squashed the idea flat. "We are here to enjoy a civilized luncheon, not gamble away our savings with childish vices, Georgie. Come, girls, eat up before my famished nephew devours it all." She plucked one sandwich from the plate, and before taking a delicate bite said, "Tell me, Jane, has your father laid eyes upon this Mr. Blackwood?" "No, ma'am," she said. "The gentleman has eluded us all completely." "Hardly surprising. I should think the new owner of Northwich Hall will have a difficult task ahead of him, and very little free time to do as he wishes, given the dilapidated state of the place," said Frederick. "It must be a frightful mess. Can you imagine the interior? Given the decades that it's lain empty, most of the cellar will need to be drained, and the roofs will be full of holes." "And the chimney full of bats," George added. "A total infestation." Mrs. Darling gave a visible shudder. "The property can't be much of an investment," said Frederick. Said the elder Mr. Darling more to himself than the rest of the party. "It's a wonder the whole place hasn't collapsed in on itself years ago." Mrs. Darling waggled one sandwich at her husband. "Oh, a ruin! Wouldn't that have been lovely? It would have made a much better ruin than that lump of stones in Upper Watley." She turned to Jane. "Can you imagine having such an inspirational vista from your own backyard? Dunham would have been the envy of artists and poets everywhere." "Well, there's no hope of that now," said Frederick sadly. "I was told on good authority that Mr. Blackwood could not be dissuaded from buying the mansion to restore it. I myself inquired with the intention of purchase, but the price was simply too steep for the worth of the property." I didn't believe an accountant of Frederick's limited quality could afford a place as grand as Northwich Hall, not for a single second. But I laid my hand upon his wrist as an appeal to pass the plate of sandwiches, and his intentions flared over his skin as bright as sunlight on snow. This was a ruse on his part, a means of impressing Jane with both his supposed wealth and his good sense in refraining from idle spending. He had boundless ambitions to impress his uncle, and a consuming desire to possess a wife, and Jane seemed the easiest route to achieve both. To that end, he wished to be seen as sensible and dependable by her, for he knew these to be traits he possessed that his younger brother lacked. I took the sandwiches from him with thanks. My head swam. I didn't usually target my quirks so purposefully, and the effort left me befuddled. "Yet Mr. Blackwood purchased it," Jane continued, oblivious to my queasiness. The elder Mr. Darling arched his brows. The village council set upon it a very high price, without option for negotiation, but Mr. Blackwood could not be dissuaded, no matter how inflated the cost. I spoke on the matter with Mr. Chowder yesterday, and he suspects the council could have asked any amount, and the gentleman would have been happy to give it. He waggled a sandwich at his wife. The council is, of course, quite divided on the sale. Some are pleased with the outcome, and scrambling to find a good use for all the money. Others are not so pleased now that a stranger is lord of the manor, and all of us are to live in his shadow. Mr. Darling took a sandwich from the plate, but before taking a bite added, "We shall see how it all turns out, but the future of Dunham doubtlessly hinges on the quality intentions of the man who now rules Northwich Hall." "But why would he want it so badly, to take such a large loss on its acquisition?" I said. Mrs. Darling dropped her voice to a hush. "No one in their right mind would buy the place. Not after what happened to poor Mr. Posey and his family," she whispered. "Your mother has told you the story, yes?" Both Jane and I nodded, but George leaned forward. "I do not know it." "Mrs. Posey and their sons all disappeared, and Mr. Posey went mad with grief," I replied. Mrs. Darling shook her head. "But that's not the whole of it," she said. "It isn't?" said Jane. "That's all we've been told." "Oh, goodness," said Mrs. Darling. "Mrs. Posey and the sons went missing, that's true." She leaned forward, her smile glittering with devilish delight. "But, my dear, one of the sons came back." Jane gasped. Yes, Mrs. Darling continued, "he came back, but he was not right in the head. So the story goes, Mr. Posey dug a well in the cellar, but he uncovered something sinister. Glowing eyes in the darkness, you know, and the distant howls of tortured souls. The boys were compelled by sinister forces to climb down into the well and investigate, but they did not come back up. And Mrs. Posey was so heartbroken she threw herself down the well too, and dashed herself to pieces on the stones. Mr. Posey had lost his entire family, all in one foul swoop." She took her cup, savoured a sip of tea, and provided a dramatic pause. Then, upon swallowing, she said, "A few months later, once the funerals were long since finished, and the village had moved on, the eldest son crawled back up from the depths of hell. One might think Mr. Posey would be happy to be reunited, but this was no loving occasion, girls. The son was depraved and warped and ghastly to behold. So I've heard his body had been mangled into a terrible abomination. 3 eyes, abscesses over the entirety of body, and an unquenchable thirst for human blood. Only the Lord knows what terrible tortures happened to him down in the unholy abyss." Her eyes grew as wide as marbles, and her fingers played over her lace cuffs like a priest manipulates a rosary. "I heard that Mr. Posey, terrified of this demonic figure confronting him, shot his son in the chest and killed him dead, then tossed the body down the abyss and covered it all over with paving stones. Then he locked the well and the stones and the gates to hell behind an oak door banded with iron, and flooded the cellar of the house." "Of course, after that he was never the same," Mr. Darling continued. "How could he be? Mr. Posey had looked upon his son's face and seen true evil, and in destroying it he destroyed himself too." A stillness fell over the sitting room. Then George whispered, "Blimey." "The village council has held possession of Northwich Hall ever since, but they priced it very high to keep safe an unwitting buyer," the elder Mr. Darling added. Mrs. Darling gave a gruff snort and said, "Yet Mr. Blackwood owns it now, and he could not be dissuaded, even with the stories or the expense." Jane glanced at me. "That does make one wonder what he's up to." "It does," I agreed. Further conversations revolved around dull topics, and we left the Darlings in mid-afternoon as a gentle rain began to fall, giving our thanks and making light-hearted promises to visit again. But as soon as we were around the corner and hurrying down the hill into the wood, our voices pitched low. "Do you believe it?" said Jane. "Of course not," I replied, as we walked down the steep track. "Wouldn't you think if a doorway to hell had opened so close to our house, we'd have noticed something? Surely the relentless screeching of yowling demons would have kept us up at night." She chuckled. "But don't you think it's interesting that Mr. Blackwood was so driven to own the place?" she said. "I wouldn't pay any amount of money for a house with such a frightful reputation." "Maybe he's unaware of the history," I said. "Or," she said, "maybe he's very aware." The rain increased, and we took shelter under her rose-pink parasol as the road carried us down from the plateau of Dreadmore Heath and into the verdant embrace of the forest vale. The leaves tinged the sunlight with a fresh green hue, and the air filled with the smell of growing things. Drops pattered on the leaves. We should ask Papa for the truth of it, I said. He'll tell us if we ask directly. He'll say we're being silly, Harry, Jane replied. But we should tell Emma and Mary. They'll be fascinated. To think, I replied, we've lived so close to such a tragic story for so many years, yet we've remained blissfully ignorant. I wonder what else we've missed, simply because we've been too close to the source, Jane replied. What else have we not questioned because we've always accepted it as fact? I said, we do not know what we do not know, and know not even to know of its absence. Jane laughed. Goodness, I feel the very fabric of my reality unraveling. After a few steps, I said, honestly, it does make me wonder what really happened to poor Mr. Posey. Oh, such a terrible story to tell over lunch, she replied, as we crossed a large puddle on the path, inching around the edge where the ferns and bushes grew. I waited until she was across before saying, you know as well as I, Casilda darling wouldn't let the loss of a guest's appetite get in the way of a good yarn. Of course not, Jane agreed, and Frederick, thinking to boast about buying Northwich Hall, never in a million years would I believe it. Oh, but he didn't buy it. Not because he isn't rich, but because he's in possession of so much good sense, I laughed. Wealthy and frugal. And he's the best hunter in all the land, even if he didn't find a grouse. He said so. We shouldn't tease him. He's well established and a fine prospect, all things considered, Jane giggled. But I can't stand a braggart, especially if he shows no skill to back it up. He's quite determined to win your affection, I said. He wants to possess you fully, Jane, and will go to any length to demonstrate how sensible he is, compared to George's gambling and carousing. She looked surprised, then waggled her finger at me. Did you use your quirk? You ought not to peer in someone else's thoughts, Harry. That's an invasion of their privacy. Ha, I laughed. It doesn't take any great army to invade Frederick's thoughts, that's for sure. I'm sure you could turn him to your will with very little effort. I snapped my fingers. George is impulsive and without as much self-control, but I wager in Frederick you'd have yourself the ingredients for a willing and devoted slave. Jane laughed. Oh, God, how awful. She hooked her arm over the crook of my elbow. I don't want a husband to control Harry. How dull would that be? I opened my mouth to agree when a sound caught my ear, and I paused. It was difficult to hear over the patter of raindrops on the leaves and umbrella, but a faint, moist, suckling sound seemed so out of place that I was certain I'd heard it. There was a small squeak to it, too, like the gentle slap of slick flesh. Jane stopped at my side, perplexed. What's that? I said. Jane listened. I don't hear anything. I strained to hear above the rain and caught it again. The sound was accompanied with a breath, a huff of sorts, but moist and bubbling. There, hear it? From the trees. Jane leaned forward. I do. She peered through the fresh spring leaves. Is there something up in the canopy? The sound abruptly ceased, as if it was suddenly aware of our interest. We walked on a few steps, but now in silence, both of us listening intently, and after a few minutes we were rewarded with another breath, behind us and above in the leaves. I think we're being followed, Jane whispered. By what? I replied. Another quiet slap, moist and damp. A squirrel with consumption? She replied, and I chuckled. It was such a small sound, and I did not yet know the magnitude of the creature following us. We walked on through the tunnel of branches and leaves, and we saw the distant opening that led into the wide fields towards the church bridge. The forest was thickest here, but the track was straight, and there was only 200 or 300 feet until we were out from under the canopy. Jane appeared outwardly calm, but her pace had quickened, and when she grabbed my hand, I felt the anticipation wicking off her skin. I didn't mean to intrude on her heart, but her fear was rising. Hurry, she urged. I heard the sound again, closer now, but I could not tell if it came from the right or the left. We no longer worried about avoiding the puddles. She held the parasol above us like a shield. Hurry, she pressed again. The breaths were close, very close, almost directly above us. I heard the rustle of wind in foliage, the patter of rain on parasol, and the rough exhalation of something very large, but I saw nothing except for shivering green leaves and diamond drops of water. Then the sound stopped, and directly before us and over the path, the thick limb of an ancient maple tree creaked. We both saw it dip down as if carrying a great weight, and Jane pulled up short with a gasp. Up there, she said, pointing to a leafy bower. "Where?" I asked, my eyes seeking any hint of an animal. "On the branch," she replied. Standing in the middle of the track, we peered into the tangle of buds and leaves, the shimmering twigs made resplendent with rainwater, and it was only very slowly that I realized my mistake. What had appeared as the rough, textured bark of an empty branch was, in fact, drawing in and out like the rolling sea, as if the tree itself had grown lungs and the ability to breathe. No tree moved like that. My fingers crept down Jane's forearm to clamp my grip around her wrist, and she telegraphed through her touch the terror that coursed through her blood. Something had engulfed the trunk of the tree, perfectly camouflaged to appear as if made of wood. It was colossal, but so fully disguised that we could not measure it. I glanced at her. She glanced at me. I gave a small nod. And together we burst into a sprint, hand in hand, under the branch and towards the exit tunnel as fast as our boots would take us, with the parasol abandoned in the middle of the track. My own fear and adrenaline was magnified by the fear coming from Jane's hand. We heard the beast crashing through the canopy above, moving with simian grace from branch to branch, yet whenever I stole a glimpse back I saw no clear indication of the body that followed us. It blended seamlessly into the background, first greens, then browns, then back to greens. But the noise of its movement and the thrashing branches revealed it to be massive, larger than a man, and unstoppable as a rhino. We burst out onto the open land with our breath heaving thick and fast in our throats. Never had I been so happy to see the church bridge, miserable St. Dismas, the cockeyed steeple and humpy graveyard, and a little further down the river valley, the stone shops and streets and post office of sleepy Dunham. When we reached the apex of the bridge, Jane and I turned with our arms locked together and looked back to the forest, which now seemed pleasant and unassuming in the cool spring drizzle. Jane pointed. "There!" I followed her finger, and I was almost certain I saw something ripple amongst the tree branches, like the glistening green body of a gigantic serpent slithering amongst the leaves. And that's the end of Chapter 4. See you tomorrow. Bye!